1 month ago, I drove the new Hyundai Ioniq 6, and here's a photo of me doing it. The reason I'm not standing next to the car right now is that I was allowed to drive the car at Hyundai's secret research and development facility at Namyang in South Korea, where there are absolutely no cameras, apart from the ones that took this photo, of course. But in today's video, I'm going to tell you what it was like to drive the Ioniq 6 and what we can expect from this Tesla Model 3 rival when it reaches Australia. I'm going to go through how much power this vehicle makes, how much range it's expected to get, and what kind of features you'll be able to buy here in Australia when the Ioniq 6 launches locally in early 2023, and how much it's going to cost. But what was it like to drive? That's the main question. Well, undoubtedly, it's similar to the Ioniq 5 and the Kia EV6 because these vehicles share so many components, from their motors to their battery to their platform, and a lot of the basic componentry of the steering and the suspension. But what I could tell from my drive in Namyang, which occurred both on a pretty cool drag strip at the R&D facility and also on public roads in the town of Namyang, which is about 40 kilometers from Seoul, is that this car feels a little bit tighter, a little bit sportier than the Ioniq 5, and that suits its sedan form factor. So what do I mean by that? Well, I aimed for as many potholes as I could find because on city streets we couldn't really go any faster than about 60 k's an hour. But what I could tell from the suspension was that the rebound damping is definitely tighter and stiffer than an Ioniq 5, and that's a good thing because this is a low car, it's a sedan, it's meant to feel sportier, and I think that it does feel a little bit tighter because the Ioniq 5 is quite softly sprung and a little bouncy at times, actually. Now, Hyundai won't tell us if the Ioniq 6 has the frequency selective dampers that are also used by the Kia EV6, but I think that it probably does. And they should mean that the Ioniq 6 rides in a more stable fashion at high speed than the Ioniq 5, which can tend to bob around a little bit, but we don't know yet. It's a similar story with the steering. Now, the cars that I drove were in Korean domestic market tune, and the steering has more resistance to it than the Ioniq 5. The Ioniq 5 has super light steering, which I think suits the kind of car that SUV is. The Ioniq 6 is a sportier car, and you definitely feel heavier weight, more feedback, and more resistance through the steering rack when you drive it, and that was immediately evident behind the wheel of this vehicle. Now, there's so many phases yet to come in our testing of the Ioniq 6, including on higher speed country roads, and there's already a black Ioniq 6 in the country right here in Australia right now undergoing local testing to make sure the suspension and the steering are right for our challenging roads. But I thought the Korean tune was already pretty good, and that just goes to show how much learning there's been at Hyundai over the last decade and how much influence the Australians have also had, because the car felt pretty much right to me already. With some fine tuning for Australia will undoubtedly not go astray. Now, as for the motors, I drove both a rear-wheel drive 168 kilowatt and an all-wheel drive 239 kilowatt version of the Ioniq 6. The motors are really quiet and refined, and you can't detect this high-pitched whine or whistle that you sometimes hear in EVs, including the Mercedes EQS 53 that I tested recently. So it's crazy that the Ioniq 6 actually felt more refined than that car, at least in the noise from the motors. They also are smooth to take off. It's a single speed automatic in this car, so no changing gears or anything like that. It feels slick and refined, and we think it'll do 0 to 100 in about 5 seconds for the all-wheel drive version, maybe a little bit slower. The Ioniq 6 is an all-electric sedan that sits on the same eGMP 800-volt electric vehicle architecture as the Ioniq 5, which is already on sale here in Australia and has been pretty well received. We like it here at Chasing Cars. It's comfy, it's pretty quick, it's good to drive every day, and it charges extremely fast. That's the killer app of these Hyundai, Kia, and Genesis vehicles on this platform. They can recharge in less than 20 minutes. Very convenient if you can find an ultra rapid charger. And the Ioniq 6 will be able to do that too, except its whole shtick is that it's going to take you further on a charge than the Ioniq 5 or the EV6, and that's because it is super aerodynamic. Even though I was driving a camouflaged car in Korea because the Ioniq 6 still hadn't been seen by the world, we've now seen what this car looks like. Hyundai calls it the electric streamliner, which is interesting language, but I see where they're coming from. This is a very slick, curvy looking sedan, which kind of looks like a hybrid of an AU Falcon and a Porsche 993 in my opinion, but somehow it all works, especially in the metal. It's actually quite a good looking car, though I understand if you're a little bit challenged by the styling. However, it's all in aid of having a low drag coefficient, just 0.21 CD, which is really low. There's just one random spec of the Mercedes EQS, which is slipperier through the air than this Hyundai. So that's a pretty cool feat. And it means that this car will be able to get more than 600 Ks of range if you go for the big 77.4 kilowatt hour battery and the smallest possible wheels. Now in Australia, we might not get that combination, but what we will get here is a mid-spec rear-wheel drive car making about 168 kilowatts of power and 350 Newton meters of torque, and a high-spec dual-motor all-wheel drive version on bigger wheels making about 239 kilowatts of power and 605 Newton meters of torque. And they'll both use a 77.4 kilowatt hour battery, which is going to give them a range, I think, of about 530 Ks for the all-wheel drive and about 570 Ks for the rear-wheel drive. So really good range, definitely more than an Ioniq 5, although not quite as much as a Tesla Model 3 long range, which remains really efficient. Although the Ioniq 6 is also extremely efficient, using about 13.5 to 14.5 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers. What else can I tell you about the Ioniq 6? Well, the interior is very similar to the Ioniq 5. It's got a few more garnishes. There's metal around the dual 12.3-inch screens, and there's also digital camera-based mirrors, and they will come to Australia. They're better than the ones on the Audi e-tron, which are almost unusable in my experience, but I still think it's kind of an answer to a question nobody asked, but the rear-wheel drive version of the car will have traditional mirrors. Otherwise, the interior is similar to Ioniq 5. The seats feel the same to me. They're comfortable. They've got heating and cooling in top spec versions, just heating probably in the rear-wheel drive version here in Australia. One interesting tidbit is that the sunroof actually opens. In the Ioniq 5, it's just fixed glass, which is useless in a hot country like Australia. At least in the Ioniq 6, it opens, and it does also have a sun blind, which is great to see. The rear seats are big enough, although the high floor to accommodate the skateboard battery does mean that your knees sit a little bit high in the back, as you can see from my static reveal video of the car at the Busan Motor Show. But overall, it feels comfy, it feels a little tighter than the Ioniq 5, it feels sporty, and it should be set to take on the Tesla Model 3 directly here in Australia when it launches in early 2023 with a likely price of between $70,000 and $80,000 before on-road costs. And as for supply, Hyundai says it is getting better. They are sending more Ioniq 5s to Australia. They think they'll be able to send us an okay number of Ioniq 6s, but all of that remains to be seen when the car lands here early next year. First impressions were positive. Of course, this was very much driving the car in a controlled environment, under camouflage. It's not the same as driving it here on an Australian country road. So you'll have to subscribe to the Chasing Cars channel to see how we feel about the car when we can really test it in our own environment, no holds barred. But those are my views. I'm keen to know what you think. Let me know down below in the comments. Hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell. And as always, thank you for watching Chasing Cars.